Hi, this is Ewan Harriott from Drumsanddrumming Music School in Abbotsford, Richmond in Victoria, Australia. So I've got a couple of YouTube videos up and I'm thinking about doing some more, but they're not going to make much sense unless I do this one. So this is going to cover some really basic stuff which you probably don't really need to know, you probably know already. I guess it's more really to introduce some terminology that I have and that I use when I'm teaching my students. So I guess the first thing I'll talk about is what the job of a drummer is, and this is what I tell all my students when they come in. There's basically your job as a drummer, but there's also the art of drumming, and your job is to provide what I call the pulse or the heartbeat of the song, of the music. So you don't have to be really an educated musician to know where the pulse is or the heartbeat is. Every song's got a heartbeat. It's what people dance to when they're in a club, and it's what you tap your foot to or what you nod your head to when you listen to your favourite song. So you don't really have to be an expert to figure that out. It's instinctive. So that's the drummer's job, really, to provide the heartbeat or the pulse. And the art of drumming, I say, begins with learning how to subdivide that pulse, or to chop the pulse up into smaller and smaller pieces. So there's two terms that I use straight away, which continue right throughout the life of my student, however long they stay with me. Pulse and subdivision of pulse. So when I'm introducing these subdivisions to my students, I also like to point out something else called, well, I call it your angle of perception, or an acronym for that, AOP. And that's how you think about what you're actually doing. So, for example, here's a bass drum pulse. Now I'm going to start subdividing that pulse on the snare drum with my hands. First of all, I'm going to hit one snare drum hit for every bass drum pulse. And then you chop that up and you go, instead of, I call it going 1 to 1, which I guess I should diverge for a second to describe that. Of course, all of the subdivisions have specific names, like in classical music a lot of people refer to them by their traditional names: crotchet, quaver, semi-quaver, demi-semi-quaver, those sorts of things. A lot of drummers, though, refer to them as quarter notes, half notes, eighth notes, 16th notes. That's probably because drumming was largely developed in the UK and in America. Okay, so I don't like to confuse my students with that specific terminology straight away. They've got enough trouble getting their head around a few other issues. So I basically refer to the subdivisions more logically and more simply. One hit to one bass drum pulse. So I call what I just did then 1 to 1. Now I'm going to do 2 to 1. 2 snare drum hits for every bass drum pulse. 3 to 1. 4 to 1. 5 to 1. 6 to 1. And so on and so on. Okay, so that's an example of the subdivisions, and everything you're ever going to do as a drummer is going to be based on pulse and subdivision of pulse. I warn my students of that straight off. They've got to be good at subdividing the pulse in as many different ways as they can. First of all on the snare drum, and because everything they're ever going to do, any beat they're ever going to learn, is going to be based around pulse and subdivision of pulse. Okay, so now just a quick mention of that term I brought up earlier, angle of perception, or AOP. We've got, sheets of music, which I actually refer to as code. It's not music. The stuff that you see in books, and that's not music. Music is a form of self-expression on the instrument that you've chosen. So I call the stuff that's written down on paper code, and you need to actually decode that stuff, which I guess I can go into in a later video. I explain to my students that really, when you're playing, you don't think of what you've seen on the paper while you're playing it. you've internalized it somehow. You're thinking about it differently. And I've given that a term or a name so that it's easier to communicate between myself and my students, these ideas. And I call that the AOP, your angle of perception. So an angle of perception on those subdivisions, for instance, is, well, you've got to try and keep the subdivisions nice and even. If you're going to do 2 subdivisions for every bass drum pulse, they've got to be even. 3 have got to be even. 4 have got to be even. But one thing that really helps me execute any of those subdivisions is the AOP I have, that whenever I'm doing an even subdivision, 2, 4 or 6, the bass drum pulse always comes down on the hand that I started with. Okay, so 2 to 1. That's how I'm thinking about, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm playing 2 to 1. Until I've internalized it, of course, and then it's kind of automatic. But it's a process you go through, and the AOPs help that if you can find an AOP, if you can find some way of perceiving what it is you're doing other than the code that's on the paper. Odd subdivisions, the pulse is going to bounce between my right hand and my left hand. So 3 to 1 is and the interesting thing is I've given that challenge to some students right in their very first lesson, and they've fumbled around with it for a good 5 or 6 minutes, and then I give them this AOP and they get it straight away. So it's not just what you're doing, it's how you're thinking about what you're doing. Now the interesting thing here is that it's extremely difficult to teach people via AOPs. Actually, I don't think you can. But I do mention it to my students really, really early on, because that's an AOP that I can describe with words and I can point out to them, and they get the understanding of what AOP means. And then later on, when we're dealing with more difficult things, it's really difficult to describe those AOPs, but if they know what I'm talking about, when I say, do you have an AOP on that? They say, maybe, or yes, or no, and if we can actually find an AOP on any of the challenges that are put in front of them, they can get it and they can internalize it much quicker, because they've used the sheet music for its purpose, it's introduced a concept, they kind of get where, you know, the beats fall, or the pulses or the subdivisions and so forth fall, but the quicker they can internalize that and relate to it via an AOP, the better they can play it. The faster they learn it and the better they can play it, comes out better as well. Now, it could also be good to mention that perhaps people don't explore the other odd subdivisions like 5s and 7s as much because they don't have a good AOP on them. So if what I said about odds and evens and how the pulse lands on either the same hand you start with or it bounces between the hands you're subdividing with, if it's an odd subdivision, that's also true of 5s. So 5s are a bit of a struggle for a lot of people, but they don't really feel that much different from 3s. If you can play 3 to 1, then you should be able to play 5 to 1, because you know that your bass drum pulse isn't always going to land on the same hand. It's going to bounce between your right and your left. So and then you speed up just a fraction and you go into 6s, which is even, which means now all of the pulses are going to land on your right hand. Then you can go into 7s. Once again, just like 3s and 5s. So let's see if I can pull that off. 5, 6 and 7. Now I wasn't actually counting like how many times I hit the drum then. I don't have a counting system in place like 1-ender, 2-ender or 1-ender, 2-ender. I'm solely focusing on the fact that I just need to speed up and I need to make sure that my right hand hits the pulse and then my left hand hits the pulse. Then my right hand hits the pulse, then my left hand hits the pulse. And I'm playing 7s. So that's a really helpful AOP. Yeah, so there's some really interesting things which I thought I'd point out in this video, because I'm going to use that terminology a fair bit in future videos and videos that I've already got up on YouTube. So rather than talk about all of this stuff and no one knowing what I mean and leaving comments going, this guy's crazy, I thought I'd probably better explain it all first.